client is highly motivated regarding time. The project is a junior high school, but the bond money only just came through and they only have 12 months to start the design, get the permit, and build the building before classes start. What might you suggest to the client? We have 4 possibilities. A, start with a CPM schedule, a critical path method schedule. B, fast track. C, suggest a new beginning date of school. D, I guess the architect should immediately start working overtime. Well, most of us probably understand that D is probably a correct answer, but it is not the correct answer. So we're not D. Then the questions come between A and B and C. Start with a CPM, a critical path method schedule. Well, any project really probably wants to start with a critical path method schedule. That's just a figuring out how the overall schedule is going to work, such that if any one thing is if any one thing needs to be done before another thing can start, then those things are on the critical path. Other things that can happen, whether something else is done or not, can float on that path. So a CPM path is a very useful way of doing scheduling, but it doesn't really necessarily pertain. It's certainly a correct answer, but it doesn't necessarily pertain to the situation that we're talking about here. So I'm going to say not A and not D. So then it comes down to B and C. C is certainly a reasonable answer of saying, well, that's just not enough time. 12 months, you really should move the date. But that's not really the architect's role to decide that sort of pro forma issue. Moving a school date is actually a huge economic and political decision. Imagine you have to rent space for an entire school for a year or something. Like, it would be a massive intake, and it would also seem like failure politically, and people would be very troubled by that. So while C may be a reasonable one, and it might be something to talk about, the actual answer here is fast track. And so when we say fast track, we're talking about the project delivery method of fast track. So what fast track is when, instead of doing the typical design bid build, so if you think of design bid build, when there's an architect and an owner, the owner hires the architect, and you go through a big, long design process. And in that design process, we've got the schematic design, we've got the design development, we then do all of the CDs. So we've got a whole big series of, say, discussions and kind of understandings about the process. We go through a bidding process. Eventually, a bidder is chosen, so now there's a GC, and that GC then builds the whole project out. Well, that's awesome, but it takes a lot of time. So that's a great thing, but in this situation, we would be, in the 12 months, we would be 4 or 5 months into it before we even had the bids going, and it just wouldn't really work. So standard design bid build won't work, but maybe fast track will. So fast track is a situation where you say, all right, we're starting here, we're going to do the drawings for the excavation and foundation systems. And then we're going to hand those drawings off, and they're going to start constructing the foundation. And while they're constructing the excavation and the foundation, we're going to keep working as the architects. So this is the architects and this is the GC. And we're going to do the maybe the structural system, the steel structural system. And then once we're done with that, we're going to hand that off. And now these guys are going to take that and start building the overall steel skeleton structural system. And there's a little bit of overlap there, so they have time to order their materials. So then the architects are continuing on, and now they're designing the interior of the building and the skin of the building. Let's say the skin of the building first. Again, there's a little time to overlap for ordering, and then the contractor starts building the skin. And then the interior. Again. So it won't save a huge amount of time, but it's going to save some time, and that's probably the only real way that you could do a 12-month for a school, something along those lines. So fast track is this way of delivering a project. So instead of design bid build, instead of design build, Instead of construction manager, this is fast track, and it overlaps the drawing time with the building time. There are some obvious advantages and obvious disadvantages. The obvious advantage we've already talked about, we can squeeze the time. So it's very useful from that standpoint. The obvious disadvantage, that means they've already built the foundation and the structural system when I'm only just now thinking about how the curtain wall is going to work. So clearly mistakes get made and you end up having to go back in and change things out after you've already done stuff. So it costs some extra money. You don't get fast track for free. It's definitely on simple projects, it might only be, say, 20% more expensive. On complicated projects, it might be 50% more expensive. So you would do it only if it was truly, truly important, if there was a lot of big money involved in going overtime. Also, it can be very complicated from a permitting standpoint. The permit officials have to be on board, and you have to kind of do a continuous process of reviewing with the permitting officials, so they would see each package of information as it went out to the GC and have their moment to change it or add something to it before the GC could start working on it. So it's very complicated, there's a lot of overlapping elements. Remember that design bid build version up here where we said we went through the schematic design, we went through the design development, we worked everything out, we got all the details, we bid it out, we know we have a low bid, then we have a contractor and they build, like, that's so much smarter of a way to go than fast track, but it takes a really long time.